Hello friends, welcome back. You join me another day working through the entire Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse. My name's Jeremy McCandless and welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Today we're approaching the back end of Numbers chapter 27 and we're going to look at the first 11 verses and we're going to look at the story of Zelophehad's daughter and how it stands as a biblical model for your inheritance still to this day. Now, people often say, I'm sure you've heard the expression, you can't take it with you. Well, if that's the case, and it definitely is, the question arises, who gets what you can't take with you? The way we transfer our property today, once we pass away, is through either having a will or not having one. Either way, that is what happens. But let's discuss the options available briefly today and how it is done today. You see, if you have a will, which is simply something that you write out, in other words, the will is nothing more than a set of instructions to allow your family, ratified by a special court called a probate court, to legally allow those wishes to be carried out. The will goes through probate, and after the probate system has determined it's a valid will, then after all debts that are paid, the assets are distributed accordingly. At that instant, all that is stated in that will is executed. But what if you don't have a will? Let's discuss that for a moment. Well, in the UK, if you pass away without a will, then the estate still goes through this process called probate, but the state essentially determines who gets your assets. With slight variation, this is the way most countries have a basis of dealing with assets after death. All around the world, in democratic countries anyway. Even socialist countries operate this way, with the exception of a very few hardline communist and Marxist countries around the world choosing to do otherwise. But how do you determine who gets the assets? What principles do they use when the state is called to make that decision because no will has been left? Well, it might surprise you to know that the basis on what is decided is rooted in what we today refer to as a Judeo-Christian principle. In other words, the guidelines applied come straight from the Bible, and this concept, among many others, is found illustrated for us here in Numbers chapter 27. Now, just in passing, before we launch off on this, looking at this one aspect today, let me just mention for you that it is not just the inheritance laws that are based on Scripture. Our whole judicial system, legal system, is based on what are called the Judeo-Christian value system. So to put it simply, everything, all of it's based on the Bible. The Jews call it the Hebrew Scriptures, we call it the Old Testament, but it's the same things. Our entire judicial system, legal structure, is based on Scripture. Did you know that? Well, what we're going to do in today's podcast is look at one part of it and how it's first established with the biblical version of inheritance laws. So welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, in the introduction I talked about how our whole Western system of democracy and legal system is based upon the biblical laws. Today we're going to look at the initial of those, the inheritance laws, and to do that I'm going to dive straight in and read for you the first 11 verses of Numbers chapter 27, which say this: The daughters of Zelophehad, son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, belonged to the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. The names of the daughters were Malha, Noha, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tizhah. They came forward and stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and the whole Israelite assembly at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and said, Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among Korah's followers who banded together against the law, but he died for his own sin and left no sons. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no sons? Give us property among our father's relatives." So Moses brought the case before the Lord, and the Lord said to him, "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives, and give their father's inheritance to them. Say to the Israelites, if a man dies and leaves no son, give his inheritance to his daughters. If he has no daughters, give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give his inheritance to his father's brothers. If his father has no brothers, give his inheritance to the nearest relative in his clan, that he may possess it. This is to have the force of law for the Israelites, as the Lord commanded Moses." Interesting. The first verse mentions this man named Zelophehad and how he has 5 daughters. Now the passage, you'll notice, goes into great detail, listing his genealogy, including his ancestors, and mentioning these daughters. And it emphasizes the importance currently at that time of having a son to carry on the family name, which was a significant cultural expectation at that time. But we are told in verse 2 that Zelophehad, this guy, has died, and his daughters, he has no sons, they approach Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders of the congregation, and everybody in fact, and they do that at the tabernacle entrance. They explain that their father dies in the wilderness, but they also mention that his death was not as a result of the rebellion led by Korah against the Lord. Instead, they're saying he died naturally, as anybody else would, as a result of their own life, and any sins that were his alone, but he died without leaving any sons. Now, this absence of son poses a significant problem regarding the inheritance of his property. Up to this point in ancient times, property typically passed to the sons. Daughters would just receive a dowry upon marriage. That was the normal way it worked in those days. So with no sons to inherit, there's no clear provision for the distribution of Zelophehad's property in this occasion. Furthermore, you will remember, in terms of the allocation of property, that we've just seen that the size of each tribe's portion of land in the promised land that they were about to enter into was determined by the size of that tribe. And since Zelophehad had no sons, there was real uncertainty here about how his portion of land might be allocated among his wider descendants, and how widely it might end up being disseminated and spread. This issue becomes even more critical considering the very importance of tribal land and its allotment, being that it was a divine ordinance in Israelite society, just very recently revealed. So to address this new dilemma, the daughters of Zelophehad seek clarification and a decision from Moses, Eleazar, and the leaders of the congregation. So this detail of the fact that they call everyone, in effect, to be involved in adjudicating this situation signals to us today that their case prompted a significant legal and cultural discussion about how this should be carried out and what it would mean for future generations. And that's what unfolds for us in the following verses. All of this emphasis and the significance of inheritance within each tribe was based around the fact that it was crucial for each member of a tribe to have a son, because it was only that way they would be seen to inherit a portion of this land, which had been their tribe's allotment. And this was, of course, meant to ensure the continuity of family lines and the preservation of ancestral properties. Now, in modern cultures, we probably lose sight of this a little bit, but we do get a picture of it and can relate to it more easily if we think of concepts and scenarios like the passing on of a family farm or a family business from one generation to the next. Similarly, Here in Israel, the passing of land from father to son was essential for maintaining this idea of family heritage and wider social stability that would bring. So the daughters of Zephaniah here recognize the importance of preserving their father's name and his inheritance, and they choose to approach Moses, but also Eliezer, representing the priesthood, and the leaders of the wider congregation, with their request to allow them to adjudicate. Now, their plea reflects not only for their desire for the inheritance, but also within it there is a commitment to honour and maintain their father's memory, which shouldn't be overlooked. And please also note the firmness, the boldness of their request, indicating, I think, their firm faith in God's promises, because remember, the request is being made about this before the children of Israel have even settled in the promised land and actually got hold of these inheritances. By appealing to Moses and the Lord, they're demonstrating both their trust in God's system, but also the fact that they trust in that God would provide for them and what he had promised, and they would uphold that inheritance in justice in their situation. So Moses, confronted with them and their circumstances, maybe for the first time in the history of Israel, he turns to the Lord for guidance. And I think there's a lesson there for all, the importance of seeking divine judgment when faced with not just the challenges of life, but things that lie beyond our human understanding. Just as Moses sought God's counsel, we too are encouraged across the whole Bible, both in the Old and New Testament. I think it's in James that tells us to seek wisdom in times of uncertainty. Anyway, ultimately this passage, I believe, is meant to serve as a reminder of both the faithfulness of God, but also reminding those who trust in that faithfulness to always seek his guidance in times of trouble, but also times when just simple clarity is needed. It encourages to approach him, the Lord, always, at all times, with our questions and our concerns, confident that he will provide the wisdom and the direction when we need it, not only in times of trouble, but here illustrated in times of uncertainty as well. So in Moses' case, the Lord is very direct. He communicates his clear decision straight away, stating very simply, the daughters of Zelophehad are right. You should give them the inheritance of their father and allow it to pass to them. Now, this divine decree settles the matter definitively, affirming that daughters absolutely have the right to inherit their father's portion of the land. It stands as a clear demonstration of God's justice and care, and in this case is a representation of, I believe, the vulnerable in society. Widows and orphans are mentioned frequently, particularly in the teachings of Jesus to follow. But interestingly, here, rooted in this chapter, we see it in verse 8, some broader legal principles are offered regarding inheritance, extending God's design, God's wisdom, beyond the specific case of Zelophehad's daughters. The Lord commands Moses to convey to the children of Israel some extra information, being that if a man dies without daughters as well, his inheritance shall pass to his brothers. And this establishes a foundational law for future cases and ensures clarity and fairness in all coming matters of inheritance in the future. But God doesn't choose to stop there. He goes further to address scenarios where someone has no son, no daughters, or even brothers. In such cases, the inheritance, he says, is to be passed on to the father's brothers, and then, if that's not the case, to the nearest relative in the family lineage. This meticulous attention to detail reflects God's deep concern for preserving and securing family heritage and maintaining stability within the wider Christian community that principle would allow. And in the closing verse we read today, verse 11, solidifies everything that's gone before. It sets all that's been said as a statute or a judgment for the children of Israel, thereby ensuring its permanence in their legal framework and forever thereafter. In other words, what we've seen here is not meant to be just a one-time ruling. It's meant to be a binding law that will guide future generations in all matters of inheritance. But also, many would say this passage offers insights into how a thing called case law is first being developed here in ancient Israel. In other words, in such instances where decisions are made, they are to become precedent, ruling principles for similar cases in the future, but we have to take the wisdom of each decision and apply it ever onward into our future thought processes and decision making. So all of this illustrates the dynamic nature of Israel's legal system established here, one that has continued down to this day. Additionally, we can see the importance of preserving society's heritage through marriage and inheritance, and the requirements for daughters inheriting their fathers' estates in situations like this would embed this. This requirement, and it reaching beyond through the family in the event of not having sons, daughters, brothers, etc., illustrates the importance of how it can be used to preserve society's heritage. Through these family inheritances, the requirement ensured that the inherited land remain within the family, the tribe, and then the nation, maintaining cohesion across the wider community. In essence, this passage showcases God's wisdom in establishing laws that promote not just fair inheritance, but the wider principle of justice, fairness, and the preservation of family and the wider cultural heritage. It also underscores for us, doesn't it, the significance of seeking divine guidance in all matters of governance and legal interpretation. These are meant to be embedded in societal structures, and by doing so, we embed God's values and principles into those societies and how we work them out in the politics of the day. Perhaps the daughters of Zephaniah thought they faced just a unique one-off dilemma, prompting them to seek God's guidance from Moses and from God himself. But God's response is clearly not just addressed to this immediate situation, but it is also a call to establish a lasting legal precedent, akin to what we would call today case law in modern legal terminology. And the case we see here serves as the foundation example for future rulings regarding inheritance, ensuring consistency and fairness in similar circumstances, but embedding them in perpetuity. Now, judges today, they still apply what's called case law in most of our democratic countries. They're not bound to adhere strictly to precedent and precedent alone, but case law still remains an important factor in all legal deliberations. In other words, we're meant to reflect the principles and values already that have been established in prior rulings, and if you follow the root and the family tree back, you see the beginnings of these rulings revealed here. Now, in the context of Numbers and this chapter, the Lord's establishment of inheritance law is much more than that. It is the beginning of this sort of quasi-early form of case law emerging within the Israelite society. He's telling them that each new ruling will be added to the existing body of legal wisdom that we are able to draw upon. Not hard and fast jot and tittle, because it recognizes the complexity and the nuances of the situations the legal system will have to deal with, but it sets in place those principles that will ensure consistency and clarities, certainly here initially in this matter of inheritance, but as we work through this book and the book to follow, we will see it spreads wider and beyond. This process of legal development begins here and has continued its broader evolution will continue it through the coming books of the Bible, but into our very legal systems today over time. The significance of this inheritance, in other words, these birthrights, I suppose you could describe them, extend way beyond just legal birthrights. They will resonate and will carry over into the broader themes of justice, family, and yes, indeed, the whole structure of society. There's a story coming soon in the book of Ruth, which, although not directly equivalent to this case of Zephaniah's daughters, still rises out of it and illustrates how adherence to the legal principles established there can lead to blessings and inclusion across the whole community. But ultimately, the principle laid out here in Numbers chapter 27, that a man's possession go to his nearest relative, and in the absence of sons, it passes down the family line, encapsulates for us the essence of the inheritance law in ancient Israel, but it also reflects the importance of family ties and the wider social continuity that the family brings. And does this at the beginning by simply providing a framework for resolving inheritance and any potential disputes, ensuring the equitable distribution of assets, thereby securing and allowing the family to flourish. The foundational principles of our judicial system today, things like the rule of law, the presumption of innocence, due process, they all find their roots in these biblical teachings. These principles ensure fairness, impartiality, and justice in our legal system to this day. They're deeply ingrained in both our laws, but I would say within our cultural ethos. Think about the rule of law for a moment, the principle that asserts that no one is above the law. It is essential for maintaining order and equality in society. Now, very soon we'll see in Deuteronomy chapter 1, God will instruct judges to hear cases impartiality, telling them they're never to show favoritism based on status or wealth. And we saw in Leviticus 19:15 this idea encapsulated, again emphasizing the importance of impartial judgment and righteousness when approaching any legal decision. Acts 10:34 in the New Testament further emphasizes that God shows no partiality, and that underscores his divine mandate for justice and fairness for all. The presumption of innocence till proven guilty is another fundamental aspect of our judicial systems to this day. This principle safeguards individuals from unjust accusations and ensures that guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Now, while this principle faces challenges all the time, particularly in the social context in which it is found, it is important and cannot be overstated because it exists purely because of the biblical notion, the whole idea of justice. Accusations against anyone of any position in society, from the very top to the very bottom, must be substantiated with evidence before guilt can be established. Due to the process established here in this passage, the principle is further introduced which guarantees that individuals are entitled to fair treatment in all legal proceedings. This ensures that everyone must receive a fair hearing and an opportunity to present or defend themselves. All of this emerges out of the context of what we're seeing revealed here in Numbers chapter 27. All of our legal proceedings, all our due process is revealed as essential for upholding justice, protecting individual rights, protecting and allowing the flourishing of the whole society. You see, these biblical principles, first shown here, serve as the foundation of our Western democracies. Our whole judicial system, our whole guiding laws, our institutions, our governmental institutions, all the societal norms that we share and value, they all emerge here. Now, of course, they're expressed in a great variety across many countries, and indeed among the many countries of the people who will be listening to this podcast. but they still, for the most part, embody timeless values of fairness, equality, and justice for all. But remember, friends, they're first shown here in the Levitical law and in the book of Numbers. It is these principles that ensure our legal system and our societal systems operate with integrity and accountability. And today, as we still navigate complex legal issues, the challenges we all face as in societies and the countries in which we live, I think it's more essential than ever to uphold these principles and recognize their biblical origins. The biblical principle of the rule of law, which asserts that nobody is above the law, has found resonance throughout history, including even in the governance of kings, monarchs, and presidents. From Magna Carta in the UK to the present day, the King or Queen of England has been expected to adhere to the laws of the land. Just like any other citizens, they are accountable to it. And this principle underscores the idea that regardless of their position or status in society, no one should be exempt from their legal obligations or protections. In contrast to the ancient political theory as advocated by Plato and the Greek philosophers, who proposed the rule of law by one recognized as what they called a philosopher king, someone who in effect stood above the law, well, for me that highlights the distinctive nature of our Western democratic biblical principles being distinctive in nature as linked back to the UK, the US, these judicial systems that are based on a Judeo-Christian worldview, not in Eastern mysticism and certainly not in the cold logic of the Stoics, as some would argue today. The presumption of innocent until proven guilty is a cornerstone of our legal system, and that itself is rooted in these biblical teachings here. We'll come to this in great detail when we reach Numbers chapter 15, which will later establish the requirement of multiple witnesses and their testimony to establish guilt, emphasizing the importance of there being real evidence and due process followed when convicting anyone. So there are principles here. There are principles that safeguard individuals from unjust accusations. The principle being that guilt must be proven, as we describe it, beyond a reasonable doubt before any conviction can occur. Due to process, as outlined for us here in its infancy in the inheritance laws of Numbers, but further revealed in Deuteronomy, ensures that individuals, everyone, will receive fair treatment and a thorough investigation before any judgment can be rendered that they have fallen foul of the law. All of which reflects the biblical mandate for justice and righteousness in all things, because we have a God who is just and right. So, it began here. Inheritance laws, to this day still seen in the UK, the US, and other Western democracies. They have biblical roots and principles at their heart. Never forget that. Without a will, the state will determine the distribution of assets based on predefined biblical laws. And whether it's through a will or through legal statutes, spinning out into the wider biblical principles of fairness, impartiality, and justice for all, that's what continues to shape and underpin our legal systems to this day. They still guide us in our approach, not just to inheritance and estate planning, but in everything that we consider to be right or wrong. And it continues to do that to this day. And I think we can say thanks be to God for that. We leave it there, and thanks for being with me today. My name's Jeremy McCandless. You've been listening to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. This podcast is available and can be subscribed to wherever you get your podcasts from. If you click on the subscribe button, it won't cost you a penny, and that way you needn't miss another single episode, and that way you can join with this community of people who've made the decision to make the study of the Bible part of the rhythm of their daily lives. The plan is to work through the whole Bible, alternate books of Old and New Testament, over how many years it takes. If you want to connect to this ministry, well, there should be a send me a message button wherever you get your podcast from. I won't actually have access or know who it's coming from, so if you are sending me a message, in your introduction, just say who you are and where you're from. Maybe if you want a little bit about yourself and anything you want to say, well, if it's appropriate, I can read it out or respond to it in a future message. Within the episode notes page, there should be links to places like the social media, the LinkedIn account, the YouTube channel, but importantly there's also a link to a thing called the Patreon community. That's the place where people can connect on a more meaningful level to this ministry, where you'll be able to join in conversations, wider conversations with me and the community about the studies we're doing together here. It's also the place where you can support this ministry if you want. Now, you don't have to do that. You can still sign up and follow me on Patreon and see what's going on there without making that financial commitment. But there are some people who choose to do that there, and that's the place where I make lots of bonus material available. I'm doing stuff all the time in the midweek. I speak at least once, sometimes twice a week outside of church environments, and there you'll get a glimpse of behind the curtain of all the preparation and all the stuff I'm doing, where I'm mainly going into holy and secular environments and trying to bring a Christian or a biblical worldview in all sorts of areas: philosophy, psychology, politics, the arts, anywhere and everywhere where people will give me a platform to speak on their subject, but to approach it from a biblical worldview. You can see all what's going on. I think there's over 50 hours of bonus and exclusive material over there on Patreon. So why not, when you've got a moment, take a look over there. Find a link to it through your episode notes page. And with that all said, the main thing, always the main thing, is the Bible Project Daily Podcast. I do have another podcast called A History of the Church podcast. That is a Christian perspective, that approach to church history, but I think I give everyone a fair shake in that. But that podcast is deliberately being placed in the secular podcast directories. You won't find it under religion and spirituality. I'm placing it in history because I'm trying to go over into that territory to people who are interested in that sort of stuff and bring them within an orbit of having a biblical and a Christian view on the interpretation of the church and its history. So if you're interested in that, I'm about 11 episodes in. 1 or 2 episodes drop a month over there whenever I can fit them in. And if you're interested in that, or know people who might be, why not share the link to it? And with that said, I'll leave it there for today. And I do hope we'll be back again tomorrow, I'm sure. I do look forward to being with you then, as we join together on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. But it's bye-bye for now.